They thought they were just hassling another young veteran's kid at Mike's auto shop on the outskirts of Pine Valley. The Shadow Wolves Motorcycle Club watched the lean teenager methodically working on a vintage Mustang in the fading daylight, his quiet focus making him seem like an easy mark to establish their presence in Jefferson County. What these hardened outlaws didn't realize was that Jason Chen's father wasn't just another disabled veteran living quietly in their small mountain town. He was David Silent Storm Chen, 7-time international martial arts champion, whose legendary career in close combat training had shaped Special Forces doctrine across 3 continents. The autumn evening wrapped around Mike's auto shop like a well-worn leather jacket, its golden light filtering through the dusty windows of the weathered brick building that had served the Pine Valley community since 1972. The scent of motor oil, fresh paint, and warm metal hung in the air, mixing with the gentle whir of industrial fans and the distant rumble of traffic from Highway 42. Inside, the polished tools gleamed under LED shop lights, while framed photographs of restored classic cars lined the walls, each one telling a story of mechanical artistry and patient dedication. Jason Chen moved with natural precision around the 1967 Mustang Fastback, his dark hair falling across focused eyes as he carefully sanded the primer coat on the car's quarter panel. At 17, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd grown up around engines and tools, understanding their language and unwritten rules through years of working alongside his father. Through the shop's broad roll-up doors, the setting sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of purple and gold, its light glinting off the chrome accents of motorcycles that had recently appeared in the gravel parking lot. David Chen sat in his usual spot by the office window, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of green tea that his son kept constantly refreshed. At 45, his powerful frame remained evident despite the slight limp, a reminder of his last deployment. His posture, even in the worn office chair, retained the perfect balance of a lifetime spent mastering martial arts, though few would guess that beneath his casual demeanor lay a warrior whose hand-to-hand combat expertise had earned him legendary status in dojos and training facilities worldwide. The evening's peaceful rhythm faltered as the rumble of motorcycle engines grew louder, bringing with it the heavy tread of steel-toed boots on gravel and the creak of leather jackets. The Shadow Wolves had been pushing west from Denver, establishing territory through intimidation and barely concealed violence, their reputation for brutal efficiency preceding them like storm clouds over the mountains. Their leader, Marcus Razorback Donovan, led the way, his face bearing a lattice of scars from prison yard battles. Behind him, his lieutenants Luke Ghost Patterson and Eric Hammer Thompson moved like dark shadows in the dying light. The shop's atmosphere shifted instantly as they entered, their presence filling the space with unspoken menace. The few remaining customers, an elderly couple discussing repairs to their RV, a local teacher picking up her sedan, and 2 high school students waiting for an oil change, grew quiet, some discreetly reaching for phones while others averted their eyes. Mike Sullivan, the shop's owner, emerged from beneath a lifted truck, his face tightening with recognition at the patches that marked these men as members of a gang whose violent reputation had been growing across 3 states. "Welcome to Mike's Auto," Jason greeted them, his voice steady despite the tension that had instantly crystallized in the air. "Shop's closing in 20 minutes, but I can get you set up for tomorrow if you need work done." Razorback ignored the offer, his eyes scanning the space with predatory assessment as the remaining customers shifted uncomfortably. The teacher quietly asked for her keys, trying to move quickly but casually toward her car. "Nice operation you got here," Razorback finally spoke, his voice carrying an edge of mock appreciation. "Real professional, quality tools, loyal customer base." Jason maintained his composure, the shop rag in his hands never stopping its methodical movement across the Mustang's surface. "Thanks. We take pride in our work. Over 40 years serving Pine Valley." Ghost moved closer, deliberately invading Jason's personal space as he ran a gloved hand along the Mustang's freshly sanded panel. "Place like this probably gets a lot of valuable cars coming through, expensive parts, high-end tools. Makes you wonder if maybe it needs some professional security." David watched the scene unfold, his exterior calm masking combat-honed instincts. He'd seen this pattern before, not just in war zones, but in reports of similar takeovers across Colorado's mountain communities. The Shadow Wolves were expanding their territory, using auto shops and repair businesses as chop shops and distribution points for their growing criminal enterprise. Before we continue with our story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow we've got something extra special coming your way. Now let's get back to Mike's auto shop, where the tension was about to reach a breaking point that would shock everyone involved. The evening sun cast long shadows through Mike's auto shop, transforming the familiar workspace into a landscape of light and shadow that David Chen had come to know intimately over the past 5 years. The overhead LED lights hummed quietly, their industrial glow mixing with the natural light to illuminate decades of automotive history preserved in every corner of the building. Classic car memorabilia adorned the walls alongside certification placements and old photographs, each telling a story of Pine Valley's evolution from a sleepy mountain town to a thriving community of 12,000 souls, nestled in the heart of Colorado's most picturesque mountain range. The shop itself was a testament to American craftsmanship, its red brick exterior weathered by countless Colorado winters, but still standing proud along Highway 42. The original neon sign, restored lovingly by Mike himself last spring, cast a warm glow that reflected off the freshly detailed cars in the front lot. Inside, the polished concrete floors bore the honorable scars of 40 years of service, oil stains that wouldn't quite come out, marks from countless tools dropped and recovered, the subtle wear patterns where generations of mechanics had stood at their stations. The air carried the complex aroma of a working shop, fresh paint and primer from the paint booth, the rich scent of leather from the upholstery station, the ever-present undertone of motor oil and metal shavings that spoke of honest work and mechanical artistry. Jason Chen had grown up in this environment, learning first from Mike Sullivan, the shop's owner, and then from his father, who'd found purpose here after his medical discharge. The 17-year-old moved through the space with the natural confidence of someone who understood every tool, every machine, every process as intimately as other teens knew their video games or social media feeds. His dark blue coveralls, already marked with the day's work, bore the shop's logo and his name, a point of pride he'd earned through years of apprenticeship that started when he was barely tall enough to reach the tool bench. The vintage Mustang fastback that dominated his workstation wasn't just another restoration project, it was a symbol of everything Mike's auto shop stood for in the community. The car belonged to Sarah Martinez, daughter of Deputy James Martinez, who'd been killed in the line of duty last year during a routine traffic stop gone wrong. The '67 Fastback had been her father's pride and joy, a project they'd planned to restore together. After his death, Mike had offered to restore it at cost, and Jason had taken on the project as his personal mission, working extra hours to ensure every detail would be perfect. The Highland green paint, still in primer stage, would match the original exactly, a color made famous by Steve McQueen in Bullitt. Through the shop's broad windows, the Rocky Mountains loomed magnificent and eternal, their peaks still holding patches of snow even in late September. The view had drawn David Chen to Pine Valley, after his last deployment with the 10th Special Forces Group had left him with a titanium rod in his leg and a need for somewhere peaceful to rebuild his life. The community had welcomed him and Jason, not just as newcomers but as family, something they'd both needed after losing Jason's mother to cancer 3 years earlier. The converted storage building out back had become David's dojo, where 3 nights a week he taught self-defense classes to local law enforcement and teenagers. The classes were his way of giving back to the community, sharing the skills that had earned him 7 international championships and the nickname Silent Storm in competitive circuits across Asia and Europe. Most of his students never knew about the medals carefully stored in his home office, or the classified missions where his hand-to-hand combat expertise had saved countless lives. To them, he was simply Mr. Chen, the quiet, limping veteran who could move with surprising grace when demonstrating a technique. The regular customers present that evening were part of the extended family Mike's auto shop had built over 4 decades. Tom and Martha Watson, both in their 70s, had been bringing their vehicles to Mike since the shop opened. Their RV, a well-maintained Winnebago, needed some minor repairs before their annual trip to visit grandchildren in Arizona. Clara Bennett, who taught chemistry at Pine Valley High School, had trusted Mike's with her Honda Civic for the past decade, appreciating how Mike and his team always took time to explain every repair in detail. The two students, Brad Cooper and Miguel Santos, were part of the shop's youth apprenticeship program, learning basic maintenance skills while earning school credit, a program David had helped establish, remembering how working with his hands had helped him adjust to civilian life. The wall behind David's usual spot displayed photographs and news clippings that most customers never really noticed. David Chen accepting his 7th International Championship trophy in Tokyo, demonstrating close combat techniques to Special Forces units, receiving commendations for his service. These hung alongside Mike's own service photos from Desert Storm and Jason's recent robotics competition victories. It was a visual history of achievement and service that reflected the values that had made the shop more than just another business in Pine Valley. As the evening light painted everything in warm amber tones, David watched his son work with quiet pride. Jason had inherited his mother's gentle nature and his father's focused intensity, a combination that made him exceptional at both the technical and artistic aspects of automotive restoration. The peaceful scene before him was everything David had hoped to find when they'd moved to Pine Valley: community, purpose, and a chance for his son to grow up surrounded by good people and honest work. But as the rumble of multiple motorcycles grew louder in the parking lot, David felt the familiar tingle at the base of his neck, the same sensation that had warned him of ambushes in remote mountain passes and dangers in dark alleys across the world. Without seeming to move, his body shifted slightly, adjusting his position for better visibility of both entrances. Years of training had taught him to trust these instincts, these almost imperceptible shifts in atmosphere that often preceded conflict. As the Shadow Wolves cut their engines outside, that combat-honed intuition told him the peaceful evening was about to take a dramatic turn. The rumble of motorcycle engines died to a growling idle before cutting out completely, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. The Shadow Wolves' arrival cast long shadows through Mike's auto shop's windows, their silhouettes darkening the warm evening light like storm clouds blocking the sun. Marcus Razorback. Donovan's massive frame filled the doorway first, his scarred face catching the shop's fluorescent lighting in a way that emphasized the lattice of old wounds earned in prison yard battles and back alley fights. Behind him, Luke, Ghost Patterson, and Eric Hammer Thompson flanked their leader like trained attack dogs, their movements synchronized from years of coordinated intimidation. Their leather cuts bore the Shadow Wolves' colors, a snarling wolf's head against a blood-red moon, along with patches that told stories of violence to those who knew how to read them. Two more members, Carlos Switchblade Rivera and Mike Ice Matthews, positioned themselves near the roll-up doors, effectively controlling all exits. The atmosphere in the shop crystallized into something heavy and dangerous. Tom Watson instinctively stepped in front of his wife Martha, while Clara Bennett clutched her car keys tighter, the metal leaving impressions in her palm. Brad Cooper and Miguel Santos, the young apprentices, froze at their workstation, the socket wrench in Miguel's hand suddenly feeling inadequate as protection. "Nice setup you got here." Razorback's voice carried the gravelly undertone of someone who'd spent years shouting orders over motorcycle engines. His eyes moved methodically around the shop, taking in the expensive tools, the partially restored classics, and the new diagnostic equipment that represented significant investment. Real professional operation. Jason continued working on the Mustang's quarter panel, his movements deliberate and controlled. He'd learned from his father that staying calm in tense situations often meant the difference between defusing conflict and igniting it. "Thanks. We take pride in our work. Been serving Pine Valley since '72. Ghost moved closer to the Mustang, his leather gloves leaving smudges on the freshly sanded primer as he ran his hand along the surface. "Shame if anything happened to a sweet ride like this. Restoration work's delicate, ain't it? Lots of things can go wrong." His voice carried the cold edge of practiced menace. "Parts get damaged, tools disappear, accidents happen." Mike Sullivan emerged from behind a lifted truck, wiping his hands on a shop rag while trying to project a calm he didn't feel. At 58, He'd dealt with his share of difficult customers and local troublemakers, but the Shadow Wolves were something else entirely. Their reputation for violence had spread through Colorado's mountain communities like wildfire, leaving behind shuttered businesses and broken lives. "We're about to close up for the evening," Mike's voice remained steady, years of military service evident in his bearing. "If you gentlemen need work done, we can set up an appointment for tomorrow." Hammer's laugh rumbled through the space like distant thunder. "Oh, we're not here for work, old-timer. We're here to talk business, real business." David Chen observed the scene with combat-honed precision, noting every detail that others might miss. The way Switchblade's jacket bulged slightly on the left side, suggesting a concealed weapon. The prison tattoos on Ice's neck that marked him as someone who'd done serious time. The subtle hand signals the group used to communicate, similar to ones he'd seen used by organized crime syndicates during his deployments in Asia. "Been hearing about this place," Razorback continued, moving deeper into the shop. "Good reputation, loyal customers, valuable inventory." He picked up a precision torque wrench, testing its weight in his hand. "Thing about valuable stuff is, it needs protection. Professional protection." Jason straightened up from his work, keeping the sanding block in his hand casual but ready. "We've got good security, cameras, alarms. The sheriff's department does regular patrols." Ghost's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Cameras break. Alarms malfunction. Cops can't be everywhere. Smart business owners, they understand this. They take precautions." The tension in the shop had reached a point where even the ambient sounds seemed muted. The hum of fluorescent lights, the tick of cooling engines, the distant highway noise all fading into background stillness. David Chen's hand remained relaxed around his coffee cup, but his mind was mapping the space like a tactical exercise, noting potential weapons, calculating angles, assessing threats with the precision that had made him legendary in both military and martial arts circles. "Way we see it," Hammer added, his massive frame casting a shadow over Jason's workstation. "This whole stretch of Highway 42 needs organization, structure, professional oversight. Accidents happen to businesses that don't understand this simple fact." He reached out to touch the Mustang's hood, his rings leaving small scratches in the fresh primer. Expensive accidents. The evening light streaming through the windows had taken on a blood-red quality as the sun settled behind the mountains, painting the scene in crimson hues that seemed appropriately ominous. The Shadow Wolves had positioned themselves with practiced efficiency, controlling the space, isolating potential resistance, establishing dominance through calculated intimidation. From his corner position, David Chen noticed how the other customers were trying to make themselves invisible, how Mike Sullivan's hand had moved closer to the phone on the wall, how his son Jason maintained his composure even as the tension ratcheted up degree by degree. Years of combat and competition had taught him to read these situations like others read books, to see the violence building before it erupted, to recognize the moment when intimidation would inevitably escalate to action. "Protection's real affordable compared to what could happen," Ghost continued, his voice carrying just enough threat to make several customers shift uncomfortably. "Just a small percentage of weekly earnings. Insurance, you might say, against unfortunate incidents." He ran his gloved finger along another fresh scratch in the Mustang's primer, a deliberate show of disrespect that made Jason's jaw tighten imperceptibly. The Shadow Wolves had positioned themselves with tactical precision throughout Mike's auto shop. Razorback commanded the central space, while Ghost and Hammer flanked the Mustang. Switchblade and Ice maintained their positions near the exits, their body language telegraphing a readiness for violence that David Chen recognized from combat zones across 3 continents. 2 more members, visible through the windows, kept their motorcycles running in the parking lot, a subtle reminder of their numbers and mobility. "Been running this shop since '72 without any problems," Mike Sullivan spoke up, his voice carrying the steady authority of a man who'd weathered storms before. "We're part of this community, protected by our own." The statement hung in the air, a gentle but firm resistance to the implied threats. Razorback's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile on anyone else. "Community's changing, old man. Highway 42's getting dangerous these days. Lots of businesses having trouble. Equipment failures, Health code violations, inventory disappearing. He picked up another expensive tool, testing its weight. Small operations like this, they're vulnerable. Things happen, unless they're smart enough to understand how the world really works. The remaining customers watched the scene unfold with growing unease. Tom Watson had quietly guided his wife Martha toward their RV, but Ice's position near the door made escape impossible. Clara Bennett, the chemistry teacher, tried to appear invisible while discreetly reaching for her phone, but Ghost's sharp glance in her direction made her freeze. Brad Cooper and Miguel Santos, the young apprentices, had backed away from their workstation, instinctively moving closer to Mike. Jason maintained his professional demeanor, though David could see the subtle signs of tension in his son's posture. Years of martial arts training had taught the boy control, how to appear calm while remaining ready. "We appreciate the offer," Jason said, carefully placing his sanding block down. "But like Mike said, we're doing fine on our own." Hammer's massive frame cast a shadow across the Mustang as he moved closer, deliberately invading Jason's personal space. "Smart kid like you should listen when adults are talking business, unless you want something happening to this sweet ride." His hand traced another scratch across the primer. Shame if all this restoration work got damaged. Through the windows, more motorcycles had pulled into the parking lot, their headlights casting long shadows into the shop. The Shadow Wolves were making a show of force, demonstrating their numbers to anyone who might consider resistance. Thomas observed the scene with practiced patience, noting how the bikers had positioned themselves to control key areas of the shop. Their technique was crude compared to the military precision he'd known, but their intent was clear: dominate the space, isolate their targets, eliminate potential interference. "Boss asked nice." Ice spoke up from his position near the door, his voice carrying the hard edge of someone who preferred when negotiations failed, which ain't his usual way. Smart people, they appreciate that kind of courtesy, understand the opportunity being offered. The evening light had faded completely now, leaving the shop's interior reflected in the dark windows. The neon sign outside cast alternating patterns of light across the concrete floor, where decades of honest work were about to collide with the harsh realities of organized crime. David Chen's hand remained steady around his cup of green tea, but his mind was already calculating angles, distances, potential weapons, and likely response times. 20 years of martial arts competition and special forces training had taught him to read violence before it erupted, to see the subtle shifts in weight and stance that telegraphed incoming attacks. He noticed how Ghost's hand kept straying to his jacket pocket, how Hammer's feet were planted in a boxer's stance, how Switchblade's eyes constantly scanned for threats, all telling signs to someone who'd spent a lifetime studying combat. "Last chance for the easy way," Ghost added, his hand resting casually near his jacket pocket in a way that David recognized as a poorly concealed weapon. "Simple business arrangement, weekly payments, no problems. Everyone stays happy, stays healthy." The threat hung in the air like smoke, choking the normally peaceful atmosphere of the shop. Mike Sullivan stepped forward, his own military training evident in his bearing. "Think you boys should leave now. We're closed." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd faced danger before. "Whatever you're selling, we're not buying." The Shadow Wolves exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke of violence to come. David watched his son's response carefully, proud of how Jason maintained his composure even as the tension reached a breaking point. The boy had learned well, both in the dojo and in life, understanding that true strength often meant knowing when to stand your ground and when to step back. But as Hammer's massive frame loomed over Jason, as Ghost's hand moved closer to his concealed weapon, as Razorback's scarred face twisted into a snarl of anticipation, David knew that years of peaceful resolution were about to give way to necessary action. Mike's auto shop had stood as more than just a business since Robert Sullivan, Mike's father, first opened its doors in 1972. Back then, Pine Valley was little more than a waypoint along Highway 42, a place where truckers stopped for coffee and local ranchers got their equipment fixed. The original building, with its red brick walls and hand-painted signs, had been Robert's dream, a place where honest work and fair prices would build something lasting in the shadow of Colorado's mountains. The shop had witnessed the town's transformation over 5 decades, from a quiet mountain community to a growing hub of 12,000 souls. Through economic ups and downs, through changes in automotive technology, through generations of families bringing their vehicles through those broad roll-up doors, Mike's auto shop had remained a constant. The walls, now adorned with photographs and memorabilia, told stories that went beyond mere car repairs. David Chen's connection to the shop began 5 years ago, when he'd limped into town with a 17-year-old Subaru and a 12-year-old son, both needing work. The titanium rod in his leg, a souvenir from his last deployment, had been giving him trouble in the mountain air. Mike Sullivan had taken one look at the way David carried himself, the military bearing that no injury could erase, and offered him a place to sit while they looked at the car. That day, as David watched Mike work, they talked about service and sacrifice. Mike had served in Desert Storm, and though their experiences were decades apart, they spoke the same language of duty and honor. When Mike learned about David's background, the 7 international championships, the years training special forces in hand-to-hand combat, the classified missions that had earned him commendations he couldn't discuss, he'd seen an opportunity to help a fellow veteran find purpose. The storage building out back had been gathering dust, filled with old parts and forgotten projects. Mike's offer to clear it out, to let David convert it into a dojo where he could teach self-defense classes, had been the beginning of a deeper integration into the community. The classes started small, a few local kids, some police officers looking to improve their skills, but word spread about the quiet instructor whose fluid movements belied his limp, whose gentle teaching style masked years of combat experience. Jason had found his own place in the shop, starting with simple tasks, sweeping floors, organizing tools, learning the basics of automotive care. Mike recognized in the boy the same focused intensity he'd seen in his own son, lost years ago in a highway accident. Teaching Jason became Mike's way of passing on not just mechanical skills, but the values that had built the shop: integrity, craftsmanship, and service to community. The Martinez Mustang project embodied everything the shop stood for. Deputy James Martinez had been a fixture in Pine Valley, known for his fair treatment of everyone, even those he had to arrest. He'd bought the '67 Fastback as a project to share with his daughter Sarah, dreaming of the day they'd cruise Highway 42 together in Steve McQueen's signature Highland Green. His death during a routine traffic stop had shaken the community to its core. When Sarah brought the car to Mike's, unable to look at it sitting untouched in their garage, the whole shop had mobilized. Mike provided parts at cost, Jason volunteered every free hour to work on the restoration, and David often stayed late, keeping his son company during long evening sessions of sanding and primer work. The project became a symbol of healing, of community coming together to preserve a father's dream for his daughter. The wall behind David's usual spot told its own history, through carefully framed photographs and news clippings. A young David Chen in his dress uniform, receiving a commendation from a general whose name remained classified. Another showed him in Tokyo, accepting his 7th championship trophy, his stance perfectly balanced despite injuries that would later end his competitive career. Next to these hung pictures of Jason growing up in the shop, learning to change oil, winning his first robotics competition with a device built from spare parts, standing proud in his new work coveralls. Mike's own history filled another wall. His father, Robert, cutting the ribbon on opening day, Mike himself in Desert Storm fatigues beside a battered Humvee, the shop's first computerized diagnostic system being installed in the '90s. Recent additions showed community events, classic car shows hosted in the parking lot, graduation ceremonies for the youth apprenticeship program that had given kids like Brad Cooper and Miguel Santos a path to skilled careers. The converted dojo out back had its own story, told through the worn mats and carefully maintained training equipment. Here, David had found a way to pass on not just martial arts techniques, but the deeper lessons of discipline, respect, and controlled power that had guided his life. Local law enforcement officers trained alongside teenagers, learning from a man who understood that true strength came from knowing when not to use it. Pine Valley itself had grown around the shop, its development reflected in the changing parade of vehicles that passed through its doors. From farm trucks and logging equipment in the early days to modern hybrid SUVs and restored classics, each vehicle brought its own story. The shop had adapted, adding new technology while maintaining the personal touch that kept generations of families coming back. The evening sun filtering through decades-old windows illuminated more than just a workplace. It revealed a cornerstone of community, a place where values were passed down alongside mechanical skills, where a veteran's experience could help shape young lives, where the pride of craftsmanship and the strength of tradition stood against the changing tides of time. As the shadow wolves circled the shop floor like predators sizing up prey, they threatened more than just a business. They challenged the very foundations of what Mike Sullivan, David Chen, and countless others had built in this valley beneath Colorado's eternal mountains. The autumn evening wrapped Mike's auto shop in deepening shadows, the sun's final rays painting the western sky in fierce oranges and purples that seemed to echo the tension building inside. Through the broad windows, the Rocky Mountains stood sentinel against the darkening horizon, their peaks catching the last golden light while the valley below settled into dusk. The shop's neon sign hummed to life automatically, its blue and red glow mixing with the fluorescent interior lights to create pools of conflicting illumination across the concrete floor. Inside, the familiar sounds of the shop had fallen into an unnatural quiet. The gentle whir of the ventilation system, the tick of cooling engines, the subtle ping of metal parts settling. All these normal evening sounds seemed muted, as if the building itself held its breath. The air carried the complex mixture of scents that marked the end of a working day. Fresh paint from the booth, warm metal and oil, the lingering aroma of Mike's coffee maker, and now the intrusive smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust brought in by the unwelcome visitors. The shadow wolves had positioned themselves with practiced efficiency throughout the space. Razorback's imposing figure dominated the center of the shop floor, his scarred face catching the overhead lights in a way that emphasized every violent story written across his features. Ghost and Hammer flanked the Mustang where Jason stood, their leather cuts creaking with each subtle movement. Switchblade and Ice maintained their positions near the exits, while the rumble of idling motorcycles outside provided a constant reminder of their reinforcements. David Chen observed how the regular customers had instinctively arranged themselves. Tom and Martha Watson had backed toward their RV, positioning themselves behind a workbench that offered minimal cover. Clara Bennett, the chemistry teacher, had moved closer to the office area, her car keys clutched tight enough to leave marks in her palm. Brad Cooper and Miguel Santos, the young apprentices, stood near the tool chest, their hands unconsciously close to potential weapons. The overhead LED lights cast harsh shadows across the shop floor, creating a landscape of light and dark that David's combat-trained mind automatically analyzed for tactical advantage. The reflection in the darkened windows had turned them into mirrors, doubling the scene in a way that made the space feel more confined. The neon sign's rhythmic pulse sent alternating patterns of color washing across chrome tools and polished surfaces, giving the familiar workspace an alien quality. Mike Sullivan had positioned himself near the center of his shop, his stance casual but ready. Decades of military training evident in how he maintained sightlines on all potential threats. The wall of photographs behind him, showing half a century of honest business and community service, stood in stark contrast to the predatory presence of the bikers who now threatened everything he'd built. The vintage Mustang at the center of the space gleamed under the lights, its fresh primer marked by deliberate scratches from Ghost's rings. The car represented more than just another restoration project. It was Deputy Martinez's legacy to his daughter, a symbol of the community's resilience and connection. Now it sat like a battle line drawn between Jason's determined stance and the encircling threat of the shadow wolves. Through the windows, more motorcycles had arrived, their headlights cutting bright swaths through the growing darkness of the parking lot. The shadow wolves were making a show of force, demonstrating their numbers to anyone who might consider resistance. Each new arrival cast additional shadows across the shop floor, creating a complex pattern of light and dark that seemed to mirror the conflict building within. The converted storage building visible through the back windows stood dark and quiet, its transformation into David's dojo, another testament to the shop's role in the community. The evening classes had been canceled due to a water main repair on the street, an ordinary inconvenience that had unexpectedly cleared the back lot where the shadow wolves now parked their additional forces. The tools of honest work surrounded them: wrenches, hammers, air compressors, diagnostic computers, each representing years of investment in both equipment and expertise. The organized chaos of a working shop had its own beauty: tools arranged for efficiency, parts carefully cataloged, projects in various stages of completion. Even now, the partially disassembled engine on the far lift waited patiently for morning, its parts laid out with precision on a clean blue shop towel. David's corner position gave him optimal views of both entrances while keeping his injured leg out of sight. Years of tactical training had taught him to use the environment to his advantage, and now his mind cataloged every detail: the distance to potential weapons, the slick spots on the floor from minor oil leaks, the position of compressed air lines, the stack of tires that could provide cover if needed. His reflection in the office window allowed him to monitor movements behind him without turning his head. The evening had transformed the familiar workspace into something more primal: a territory under threat, a community stronghold facing invasion, a place where decades of peaceful commerce teetered on the edge of violence. The shadow wolves had chosen their timing well, arriving when the day shift had ended, but before the night's full darkness would draw attention to their numbers. The few remaining customers stood as unwilling witnesses to this collision between the old order of community values and the encroaching chaos that had followed the gang's westward expansion. As the last direct sunlight faded from the shop's windows, the artificial lighting took full control of the space, casting everything in stark relief. The shadows of the bikers stretched long across the floor, while the gleam of tools and chrome surfaces created points of bright reflection throughout the shop. The air had grown heavier with tension, each breath carrying the weight of impending confrontation. Even the distant sound of traffic on Highway 42 seemed muted, as if the outside world held its distance from the drama unfolding within Mike's auto shop. "Better listen to my boy Ghost here," Razorback's voice cut through the tension, each word measured and threatening. "Way I see it, you got two choices. Smart choice means you get our professional protection. Other choice?" He picked up a precision torque wrench, testing its weight. "Well, that gets expensive real quick." Two more shadow wolves entered through the main door, their patches identifying them as Pete Bruiser Jackson and Tommy Viper Rodriguez, bringing their total presence to 8 inside the shop. The pressure in the room ratcheted up another notch as Hammer shifted his massive frame, deliberately knocking over a carefully arranged tray of tools. The crash of metal on concrete made everyone jump, except David Chen, whose steady gaze never wavered from his careful observation of the scene. Jason remained at the Mustang, his hands steady but ready, while Mike Sullivan's face tightened at the deliberate disrespect to his shop. "Think about Sarah Martinez," Ghost said, running his hand along the Mustang's surface again. "Sweet girl still grieving her daddy. Shame if something happened to his car. Fire maybe. Brake failure when she takes it out for that first drive." The threat hung in the air like poison, making Brad Cooper take an involuntary step forward before Miguel Santos grabbed his arm, holding him back. David noticed how Switchblade's hand moved to his lower back when Brad moved, how Ice shifted his weight to a fighter's stance, how Viper and Bruiser spread out to cover more ground. The Shadow Wolves operated with the coordinated precision of predators who'd hunted together before. Their positioning cut off clear paths to both exits, while their numbers created multiple threat points that would overwhelm most resistance. Clara Bennett's phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. When she bent to retrieve it, Hammer's voice boomed across the space. "Leave it." The teacher froze, then slowly straightened, her face pale but composed. Tom Watson's arm tightened protectively around his wife Martha's shoulders, while the elderly couple tried to make themselves as inconspicuous as possible. "Weekly payments," Razorback continued, setting down the torque wrench with exaggerated care. $5,000, cash. Consider it an investment in your future." He smiled, the expression making his facial scars twist grotesquely. "First payment due Friday. Then we ensure nothing bad happens to your nice shop, your expensive tools, your customers' cars." The air compressor kicked on automatically, its sudden noise making several people flinch. David used the moment to shift his position slightly, adjusting his angle to better cover Jason while maintaining sightlines on all the threats. His combat-trained mind had already categorized each shadow wolf by their fighting style, their weapon preferences, their likely reaction times. "This is a family business." Mike's voice carried the steady authority of someone who'd faced danger before. "Been serving this community since before you boys were born. We don't need your kind of protection." The words were civil, but the steel beneath them was unmistakable. Razorback's face hardened, all pretense of negotiation vanishing. "Family business," he spat the words. "That's exactly why you need protection. Family can get hurt. Accidents happen. Cars crash. Fires start. People disappear." He moved closer to Mike, using his height advantage to loom over the older man. $5,000 a week's cheap compared to hospital bills, or funeral costs. Jason's hands tightened on the sanding block he still held, his knuckles whitening slightly. David recognized the tension in his son's shoulders, the subtle shift in his stance that reflected years of martial arts training. The boy had learned control in the dojo, but facing threats to family had a way of testing even the strongest discipline. "Boss asked nice," Bruiser called from near the entrance, his voice carrying the eager edge of someone hoping for violence. "Time's about up for playing friendly." Outside, more motorcycles had arrived, their headlights sweeping across the shop's windows as they circled the building. The Shadow Wolves were making sure everyone understood the full extent of their force. Ghost moved closer to Jason, deliberately invading his space. "Young guy like you, got your whole life ahead of you. Be ashamed to spend it in a wheelchair, or watching your old man try to run this place from one." The threat was calculated, aimed at both father and son. David's grip on his teacup remained steady, but his mind had already mapped out the exact sequence of moves that could incapacitate Ghost before he could reach for his concealed weapon. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their steady drone a counterpoint to the tension filling the space. Tools gleamed on their racks like arsenal, while decades of automotive history watched silently from photographs on the walls. The shop that had been a cornerstone of community for over 40 years now stood as a battlefield, with the values it represented under direct assault from forces that understood only power and fear. "Last chance," Razorback announced, his voice carrying the finality of someone used to getting his way through violence. $5,000 a week starts Friday, or we show you why businesses that say no don't stay in business long." The threat rippled through the space, making the already tense atmosphere crystallize into something deadly. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, where decades of peaceful commerce teetered on the brink of erupting into violence that would change Pine Valley forever. "Think real careful about your next words." Razorback's voice dropped lower, carrying the kind of threat that had made hardened criminals back down in prison yards. "Because once we stop being polite, there's no going back. A lot can happen to a shop like this. Tools break, cars burn, people get hurt." He moved closer to Mike Sullivan, his scarred face twisted in anticipation of violence. Ghost's hand slid inside his leather jacket, the movement deliberate and threatening. "Maybe we start with the kids' hands. Hard to work on cars with broken fingers." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking the last remnants of peaceful resolution from the shop's atmosphere. Jason stood his ground at the Mustang, his father's training evident in how he controlled his breathing, maintained his balance, stayed ready without telegraphing intent. "Or we could start with the old man's other leg," Hammer added, his massive frame shifting to block more of the shop floor. "Make that limp symmetrical." The threat aimed at David Chen drew a sharp intake of breath from Clara Bennett, while Tom Watson's weathered hands curled into helpless fists. The Shadow Wolves had chosen their targets with cruel precision, understanding that threats to family cut deeper than any physical intimidation. Mike Sullivan's military bearing remained steady, though decades of grease and honest work had long ago replaced combat calluses on his hands. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd earned his place in the community through service rather than fear. "Leave my shop. Leave these people alone. Find somewhere else to peddle your protection." The sound of additional motorcycles arriving outside added another layer of menace to the situation. Through the windows, headlights swept across the shop's interior like searchlights, creating shifting patterns of shadow and illumination that transformed the familiar workspace into something alien and threatening. The shadow wolves had brought their full strength to bear, making sure everyone understood the consequences of resistance. "Wrong answer," Razorback snarled, dropping all pretense of negotiation. He nodded to Ghost and Hammer, who began moving toward Jason with practiced coordination. Time to teach Pine Valley how the world really works, starting with this happy little family business. David Chen's teacup settled onto the table with a sound barely louder than a whisper, yet somehow it drew every eye in the shop. The elderly veteran made no sudden movements as he rose, his actions smooth and measured, but something in his manner caused the bikers to shift their attention from his son to him. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The fluorescent lights cast David's shadow across the shop floor, somehow longer and more substantial than his physical presence would suggest. His limp remained evident as he took one step forward, then another, but it didn't diminish the sudden sense of contained power that seemed to emanate from his carefully controlled movements. "You know." David's voice carried the quiet authority that had once commanded Special Forces units through covert operations. "In 20 years of competitive martial arts and military service, I've learned that there are two kinds of people who resort to intimidation." He took another measured step, causing Ghost and Hammer to unconsciously adjust their positions. "Those who don't know any better, and those who know they can't win a fair fight." Razorback's scarred face twisted in contempt, missing entirely the way David had positioned himself to control the central space of the shop floor. "Sit back down, old man, before you get hurt. This ain't about you." But something in David's continued movement, in the practiced precision of his steps, caused Ice and Switchblade to exchange uncertain glances. "Actually," David replied, his tone remaining conversational even as his presence seemed to fill more of the space, "this is very much about me, about my son, about this shop, about this community." Each word was punctuated by another step, his movements creating a subtle pattern that only years of combat experience would recognize as a tactical approach. "And about teaching you the difference between intimidation and real combat." The tension in the shop had reached a point where even the air seemed to crackle with potential violence. The shadow wolves had unconsciously shifted their positions, responding to some primal instinct that warned them this supposedly vulnerable target was something altogether different from what they'd assumed. David's next words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Last chance to leave quietly," he offered, his stance now perfectly balanced despite his injured leg. "After that, I stopped being polite." The echo of Razorback's earlier threat hung in the air, but now charged with a different kind of promise, one backed by years of professional violence rather than mere intimidation. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, where the difference between posturing and true combat experience was about to be demonstrated in ways the shadow wolves had never anticipated. The room seemed to hold its breath. Razorback's sneer deepened, his scarred lips pulling tight as he processed David's words. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stalled, the oppressive silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the compressor and the faint click of the fluorescent lights above. Every eye in the shop, even the hardened bikers, was trained on David. His posture was calm, unhurried, but it radiated a quiet, undeniable intensity that neither Razorback nor his crew had anticipated. Ghost's hand remained inside his jacket, but now the fingers curled around the grip of his knife with hesitation. He studied David, narrowing his eyes, trying to read the man. The subtle shift in the way the gang had positioned themselves, tightening ranks, subtly shifting their weight, was a clear indication that the balance of power had shifted. They hadn't expected the old man to stand his ground. He wasn't supposed to be a threat. He was just another relic, another casualty of time and age. But now, in the dim glow of the shop, it was clear he was something else entirely. Razorback's fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes never leaving David. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, before the tension finally snapped. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old man," Razorback growled, his voice low but edged with a simmering rage. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of David's presence pressing in on him. For the first time there was doubt in his eyes, a flicker, a crack in the veneer of invulnerability he had worn for so long. David didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, his body language calm and controlled. "Maybe you don't either." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years of experience in situations like this, years of dealing with people who thought they could control others through fear. Jason shifted slightly, his grip tightening on the sanding block, as his eyes flicked between his father and the gang. The tension in the air was suffocating, but he was more focused than ever, ready to move the second things turned violent. His training in the dojo, honed for years under David's watchful eye, had taught him how to anticipate, how to react, how to wait for the right moment. That moment was closing in fast, and he could feel it. Bruiser snorted, a low chuckle escaping his lips. "You're really gonna try and stand up to us, huh? A couple of old men and a kid?" His voice carried a mix of disbelief and contempt, his eyes flicking between David and Jason. "You're out of your league." He took a step forward, but the others seemed to hold back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Mike Sullivan, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was measured but firm. "You want to make your threats, Razorback? Fine. But you don't get to come into my shop, my home, and make demands. You don't get to hurt my family or my community. You want to see what happens when you push a man to the edge, come find out. But don't make the mistake of thinking you have us cornered." The subtle but deliberate shift in Mike's tone made the air feel even heavier, like the calm before a storm. He was a man who had earned the respect of this town with his blood, sweat, and years of hard work. The shop wasn't just a business, it was a legacy, and he wasn't about to let some group of thugs tear it down without a fight. Razorback's eyes flicked to Mike, a brief flash of recognition passing through them. He had underestimated the man, but it was too late to back down now. The threat had already been made, and there was no turning back. "You think this is some kind of standoff?" Razorback's voice was dangerous now, cold with the certainty of someone who was used to making others bow to their will. "This is a warning, Mike, a reminder of how things work around here. You think the people in this town will care when your shop burns down, or when your boy ends up in a hospital bed?" David took another step forward, his movements slow but deliberate, almost as if he were walking through a memory. "I don't care what you think you can do," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't intimidate me, and you certainly don't intimidate my son. We've fought wars you'll never understand. We've fought battles that have nothing to do with money or fear." For a moment, there was a flicker of understanding in Razorback's eyes. He had seen men like David before, calm, collected, dangerous. Men who didn't care about the petty threats of gangs or the cheap posturing of tough guys. Razorback's hand twitched again, but this time it wasn't toward his knife. It was toward the pistol holstered under his jacket. David saw the movement, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. His stance didn't change, but every muscle was ready, coiled like a spring. Jason's eyes locked onto his father, and in that brief, unspoken exchange, both understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a fight for the shop, it was a fight for survival. In the distance, the rumble of more motorcycles echoed outside, the low growl of engines promising reinforcements. But inside, the real battle was already underway. One of wills, one of values, one of determination. And right now, it wasn't clear who would emerge the victor. The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, drowning out the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant drone of traffic. The gang outside was making sure their presence was felt. But inside the shop, the only sound that mattered was the strained silence between David and Razorback. Razorback's hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching, but he hesitated. The atmosphere had shifted so drastically that even the hard-faced bikers seemed uncertain. Ghost looked over at Hammer, then at Ice and Switchblade. No one moved. Not even Bruiser, who stood with his arms crossed, lips tight in a grimace. The balance of power had swung. It was clear that Razorback, for all his bravado, was trying to calculate the odds. He had expected a standard intimidation game, the kind that always worked in the past. But this situation, This moment was different. David wasn't the kind of man to be cowed by threats. His unwavering calm was a weapon in itself, a stark contrast to the violent unpredictability of the Shadow Wolves. Finally, Razorback spoke, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You don't get to talk like that and walk away, old man. You either take our offer or you're going to learn how much it costs to say no to the wrong people." David's eyes never left Razorback's, but his voice remained even, like he was speaking to a child throwing a tantrum. "You don't get to set the rules here. You came into my shop, threatened my family, and now you want to talk about cost? I'll teach you the real price of messing with people who know how to fight back." The air in the room crackled, thick with unspoken challenge. Razorback's hand slid down to his side, his fingers finally brushing the cold steel of his pistol's grip. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, the mounting tension, the anticipation of violence. But before he could draw, a voice called out from the back of the shop, sharp and clear. "Hold on a minute, Razorback." Everyone turned toward the sound, surprised by the interruption. It was Brad Cooper, the mechanic who had been quiet up until now, his face pale but his expression set. He stood near the far side of the shop, his body tense, but his eyes weren't on Razorback or his crew. They were on the door. For a moment, the gang was thrown off balance, their attention diverted. But before Razorback could respond, the front door swung open with a sharp jangle of the bell above it, and the first of the motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. 2 more bikes roared into view, followed by a third. This wasn't a small contingent anymore. These weren't just the usual 2 or 3 of Razorback's regular enforcers. More men were coming. The Shadow Wolves were making sure they had the numbers to finish what they'd started. Mike's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, but he remained silent. Jason's fingers curled instinctively around the sanding block, but he stood his ground, waiting for the right moment to strike. David's gaze flicked between his son and Razorback, calculating, always calculating. "Looks like you called in the cavalry, Razorback," Mike said, his voice tinged with irony. "Hope they brought more than just muscle." Razorback grinned darkly, his eyes flashing with menace. "We brought what we need, Mike, and now we're gonna take what's ours." But before Razorback could make another move, a new sound cut through the tension, the unmistakable rattle of a sliding door opening at the back of the shop. A shadow emerged from the darkness of the workshop, moving with the fluid grace of someone used to the weight of danger. It was David's old friend, a former military contact who had always kept an eye on things in Pine Valley. Ben Pierce, a tall, wiry man with close-cropped hair and a hard stare, stepped into view, his eyes immediately locking onto the gang. He was dressed in dark tactical gear, his movements deliberate and confident. A long-barreled rifle rested in his hands, its muzzle aimed casually downward but unmistakably a warning. Razorback's grin faltered. His eyes darted to the new arrival, then back to David, a slow realization dawning on him. David hadn't been bluffing. This was a different kind of fight. "You really want to push this, Razorback?" Ben's voice was calm, measured, but the implication was clear. He didn't need to raise his weapon to convey the weight of his presence. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew exactly how it would play out if things escalated. The bikers looked between each other, uncertainty beginning to take root. Razorback, who had been so sure moments before, now had to account for a new player, someone who wasn't here for a negotiation. David's voice, still calm but unwavering, filled the charged silence. "The price just went up, Razorback. You've got a choice now. Walk away or find out what happens when you push a family man too far." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Razorback's hand left his pistol, and he took a step back. "This ain't over, old man," he muttered, his voice thick with the promise of future conflict. But for now, the storm was held at bay. The bikers began to back off, their postures shifting from aggressors to wary retreat. And for the first time in the evening, the weight of potential violence seemed to lift, just slightly, as the Shadow Wolves realized that Mike's auto shop wasn't going down without one hell of a fight. The atmosphere in the shop remained thick with tension, but the arrival of Ben Pierce had shifted the balance. Razorback's eyes flicked over Ben's rifle, then back to David, but his posture had already softened. The weight of the situation was clear. He wasn't dealing with a mere old man anymore. He was up against a network of people who were prepared to defend what mattered to them. And that was a calculation Razorback wasn't prepared to make. The gang, once brimming with the kind of swagger that came from numbers and reputation, now appeared uncertain. Bruiser, who had been itching for a fight, shifted his stance, looking between his leader and the newcomer. Ice cracked his knuckles, but his eyes kept darting toward the door as though waiting for something to go horribly wrong. Even Switchblade, always cool under pressure, looked uneasy with the new element in play. Razorback's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a tight, humorless smile. "So that's how it's gonna be, huh?" His voice was low, laced with a venomous calm. "You really think you can hold off the Shadow Wolves like this?" David's reply came slowly, his words deliberate. "I'm not holding you off, Razorback. I'm just giving you the chance to leave with whatever's left of your pride. That's your last warning. Walk away." For a moment, the tension hung between them like a fragile thread, one tug away from snapping. The sound of more engines revving outside, 2, then 3 more bikes, was enough to break the silence. More bikers were closing in, the pressure mounting. But now, there was no longer the certainty that things would play out in their favor. Ben took a half step forward, the rifle shifting slightly in his hands. His presence alone was a quiet declaration. There are consequences for this kind of behavior. Razorback's lip curled again, but this time it was more of a grimace. His eyes flicked to the door, where the faint shadows of more bikers could be seen creeping into the dim light of the parking lot. He looked at his crew, then back to David and Ben. The realization hit him like a cold slap. The Shadow Wolves weren't in control here, not anymore. "All right," Razorback muttered, his voice grudging, but the edge of anger still simmering beneath. "We'll walk, for now." The gang shifted uneasily, looking to their leader for further direction, but Razorback's attention was already on the door, his mind calculating the next move. "But don't think this is over, old man. You've just delayed the inevitable." David didn't flinch. He didn't move at all, his eyes never leaving Razorback's. "The inevitable? You still don't get it, Razorback. This is over. This shop, this family. We're not your target anymore. You've made a mistake coming here." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the compressor and the whirr of distant motorcycles. The threat of violence still hung in the air, but the momentum had shifted. Razorback, visibly fuming, turned on his heel, his words cutting through the space like a final warning. "You'll regret this." As the gang started to file out, Razorback turned one last time to look at David, Ben, and the Sullivan family. His expression was one of grudging respect, mixed with simmering fury. "Enjoy your victory," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "It's gonna cost you." Ben watched them leave, his eyes narrowing as he observed the retreating figures of the Shadow Wolves. He could feel the danger still lingering in the air, the unspoken promise of retribution that Razorback was all too eager to fulfill. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. The bikers filed out of the shop, their motorcycles revving in unison as they peeled away into the night. The door swung shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the shop like the ringing of a bell. David let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, but he wasn't fooled. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mike Sullivan stood still for a moment longer, his face grim, before turning toward the others. "They'll be back," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of experience. "And next time they won't leave without trying to burn this place down." Jason stepped forward, his jaw clenched, but his eyes never left the door. "We'll be ready." Ben lowered his rifle, stepping closer to David and Mike. "You've got a good crew here, but don't underestimate them. Razorback's not one to forget a loss like this." David gave a brief nod. "We know, but we're not going down without a fight." Mike's eyes flicked to the door one last time, his face a mask of determination. "This town doesn't bow to threats. We stand together, and as long as we stand, we fight." The door to Mike's auto shop closed with a final click, and for a moment everything seemed to return to an uneasy silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their soft buzz a reminder of the stillness that had fallen in the aftermath of the confrontation. The motorcycles outside had faded into the night, their distant engines a sign that the shadow wolves were regrouping. But no one in the shop was fooled into thinking the threat was gone. David turned toward the others, his eyes sweeping over the familiar faces of his family, his friends, the people he'd spent years working alongside. They were shaken, but not broken. This was their home, and they weren't about to let anyone take it from them. Jason, still standing near the Mustang, clenched his fists at his sides, his expression tight with unresolved anger. They won't just let it go. They'll come back with more. They've got to. We're their mark now. Mike Sullivan, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward. You're right, Jason, they'll come back. They think they've got the muscle to break us, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. His eyes flicked briefly to David, a silent acknowledgement of the experience that ran through the older man's veins. We'll be ready next time, and we'll be more than ready. Ben Pierce, still standing near the back, gave a quiet grunt of agreement. He was a man of few words, but his presence spoke volumes. Next time they come, they'll know they're walking into a hornet's nest. But it's not just about fighting. It's about making sure they don't think they can just roll in here and do whatever they want. David's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly. It's not just about defending the shop. It's about showing them there are consequences for this kind of behavior. This isn't Pine Valley anymore, where people roll over when the tough guys come in. This is our town, and we're going to make sure they understand that. Mike grunted. You think that's enough? You think it'll be that simple? Those guys have been running roughshod over this town for months now, David. They've made people afraid to even leave their homes. I know, David replied, his voice low. But fear only works when people believe they have no choice. The second they see they're not in control, that's when they start losing ground. Jason stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the door, though his hands remained steady at his sides. But how do we stop them? We can't just wait around for them to come back and hit us harder next time. We've got to hit them first. Mike and David exchanged a glance. There was a shared understanding in the way they looked at each other, an unspoken agreement. The stakes had just been raised, and now the only option was to take the fight to the shadow wolves before they could regroup and launch a full-scale attack. David spoke again, his tone calm but decisive. We start by making it clear that this shop, this town, our lives, are not up for grabs. We hit them where it hurts. We take away their confidence, and we do it fast. Ben spoke up again, his voice steady. I've got a few contacts in the city who owe me a favor. If we can get the word out about what happened tonight, we might be able to turn some of that fear against them. Make sure the shadow wolves understand that the longer they hang around here, the more they'll lose. Jason's eyes lit up. We bring the fight to them. Let them know they're not the only ones who know how to play dirty. Mike's jaw tightened, but his expression shifted from grim determination to something harder. Exactly. We can't wait for them to make the first move again. We have to be ready to fight back, on our terms, and we'll do it in a way they'll never see coming. David nodded, his eyes scanning the shop one last time, as if he could see through the walls to where the shadow wolves were plotting their next move. We'll need more than just muscle. We need to make them think twice about walking into Pine Valley again. The next few days felt like a slow boil. The shadow wolves had retreated, but their presence still loomed over Pine Valley like an unfinished storm. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they came back, and when they did, the stakes would be higher. But the Sullivan family wasn't backing down, and neither was anyone else at Mike's auto shop. David had seen worse, been through worse, and he wasn't about to let a gang of bikers bulldoze his town. Mike, Jason, and Ben worked tirelessly to fortify the shop. They reinforced the doors, set up floodlights around the parking lot, and made sure every corner of the place was covered. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Pine Valley, and people who had once been too scared to speak out were now offering their support. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, David and Mike sat at the back of the shop, sharing a quiet moment as the sounds of hammers and drills echoed from inside. The rest of the crew was finishing the final touches on the perimeter. "You think it'll be enough?" Mike asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. David didn't answer right away. He watched the horizon, the orange glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. "It's not about whether it's enough," he said finally. "It's about sending a message." Mike nodded, his expression hard. "That's what I'm afraid of. I don't think Razorback and his boys are the kind to walk away just because we put up a few extra lights." David stood, his body moving with the kind of fluid precision that betrayed years of military training. "They'll come back, but they won't know what hit them." As if on cue, the sound of motorcycles echoed through the valley. A low rumble at first, distant but unmistakable. David's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his side, and he met Mike's eyes. This was it. The shadow wolves were back, and they were coming in force. Ben, who had been watching the horizon from the rear of the shop, turned to them with a grim expression. "Looks like they've brought the whole damn pack." The rumble of engines grew louder, then stopped. The low growl of the motorcycles was replaced by the soft clink of metal and the scuff of boots on gravel. They were close now. Too close. David moved quickly, ushering Mike and Jason behind the reinforced walls of the shop. Ben followed, his rifle at the ready. Then, as if to make sure they had everyone's attention, the first shadow wolf stepped into the glow of the floodlights. Razorback. His scarred face twisted into a grin as he took in the preparations. Behind him, the rest of his crew spread out, surrounding the shop like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. "You really think this is going to scare us off, old man?" Razorback's voice rang out, carrying a malicious edge. "You think we don't know how to handle a little security? We've been doing this longer than you've been breathing." David stepped forward, his figure emerging from the shadows. His voice was cold, but it carried the weight of finality. "You've underestimated us from the beginning, and now you're going to find out what happens when you make the wrong choice." Razorback's grin faltered for a moment, and his eyes flicked to the men behind him, as though unsure of how to proceed. The shadow wolves had always been the ones to instill fear, to be the ones in control. But now, as they looked around the shop, they saw something different. Resolve, strength, and the undeniable presence of people who weren't going to back down. The tension hung thick in the air for a moment longer before Razorback barked a laugh, though it lacked conviction. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But it's not going to be enough to save you. You've already pissed off the wrong people." David didn't flinch. "You don't get it, Razorback. You're not the ones in control here. You never were." And then, with a sudden movement, he gestured to Ben, who immediately raised his rifle and aimed it at the gang. It wasn't a direct threat, just a warning, one that would make any rational person pause. "You want to keep pushing? Go ahead," David said, his voice cold and steady. "But you'll have to get through us first." Razorback's eyes flicked from Ben's rifle to David's unyielding gaze. For a moment, the gang leader hesitated. The light from the floodlights illuminated his face, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't sure who he was dealing with anymore. "We'll see how long you last, old man," Razorback spat, turning on his heel and signaling his crew to retreat. The rest of the shadow wolves followed his lead, though the look in their eyes was one of frustration. They weren't used to losing, and tonight, that was exactly what had happened. As the gang retreated, their motorcycles revving and roaring as they disappeared into the darkness, a sense of triumph washed over the shop. The threat had been momentarily repelled, but everyone knew this wasn't the end. Razorback had made it clear, this fight wasn't over. Inside the shop, the crew gathered in a tight circle, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and determination. Mike looked over at David. "That's it then? They're just gonna leave us alone?" David shook his head. This is just the first round. But it's a start. They know we're not afraid anymore." Jason stepped forward, his voice calm, but filled with the confidence that had been lacking before. "So, what do we do now?" David smiled, a small but reassuring gesture. "Now we get ready for round 2, but next time we'll be the ones calling the shots." The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke over Pine Valley, A new chapter began for Mike's auto shop. The shadow wolves might still be out there, but so were the people of the town. Strong, united, and no longer willing to live in fear. David, Mike, Jason, and the others knew there would be more battles ahead, more threats to face. But for the first time in a long while, they weren't just reacting. They were ready to fight back. And this time, the shadow wolves would be the ones to learn a lesson about the real cost of their actions. And as long as the people of Pine Valley stood together, they knew they could weather any storm. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to see what happens next, don't miss our upcoming video. We've got more action, drama, and suspense coming your way. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for the next chapter. You won't want to miss it.